Is it recording for the cloud?
I'll set it going now.
Sounds good. Okay. So thank you all for joining us this evening or morning or whatever time it is where you are. We're too cosmopolitan of an organization to pick a time. In all cases, thank you for being here. This is a moderated panel entitled Why I Joined Platypus, the Sixth Phase. Platypus regularly hosts panels with titles similar to this, which attempt to digest the accumulated generational experience of its members. Today's panel is on the sixth phase, which at this point in the year 2020 still is the source of some debate. The sixth phase has been variously marked by members as the left since 2018, which has featured phenomena such as the 2018 midterm election blues in the United States and a return to base building, the International Socialist Organization dissolving in March 2019, and the further collapse of the sectarian left, the defeat of Corbyn in the United Kingdom in December 2019, and Sanders in the United States in March 2020, and recently the further crack up of neo-social democracy under the pressure of the coronavirus. Today, we will reflect on the recent initiatives during this phase and what they mean for our moment in history. Now, to shift gears very briefly, Horkheimer, in a passage that I believe can be found in Dawn and Decline, he speaks of the career of the professional revolutionary as one that does not provide honorary titles or banquets, wealth, or fame, and to compare great things to small, the most important organizing work in Platypus is often thankless. So with that in mind, I'd just like to take a moment to thank the other members of the committee for their efforts in planning and promoting this event. Once coronavirus threw a wrench into the international convention plans, the committee leapt into action quickly to make sure an event like this took place. I'd also like to thank the support squad we have here managing Zoom and for setting up the webinar and managing the Q&A with me and all the other tech stuff they do. And finally, I'd like to thank the panelists who agreed to speak today. You're etching your indelible marks on the world of Platypus before our eyes. The future is in your hands. For this panel, we have the privilege of hearing conscientious reflections from 4 recently joined members. And I've assigned their speaking order in terms of their geographic location where their original chapters were, from west to east. We have Carson Wright from Corvallis. We have Grant Tyler from Chicago. We have Jakob from Berlin. And Luc Brander-Giroux from Shanghai. And we have asked them to reflect on the following questions. Why did you join Platypus? What has this decision meant for you? What initiatives have you been involved in recently? And what did you learn in that process about yourself, about the left, and about Platypus? Normally I do a little bit more introducing of the panelists, but actually the point of the panel is for you all to do that today. You will each have up to 10 minutes for opening remarks, though you don't have to take the full time, followed by up to 3 minutes for responses to each other if you need it. Then the floor will be open to the audience for a Q&A to close the event. During your remarks, I will try to discreetly signal to you when you have a minute left, although that can be difficult on Zoom. I may have to interrupt you. And I ask that the audience during Q&A please formulate your thoughts in advance so you can post them in the Q&A box, and the panelists will have a clear and concise question in mind when formulating their responses. And this event will conclude promptly within 2 hours. So Carson, if you're ready, I'll mute myself and you can take it away.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And thumbs up from the other panelists. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so after participating in the Corvallis reading group on and off for about a year and a half, I guess it just made sense to join. I've been doing it for quite a while at that point, and it just seemed like I should just commit because I've already, been involved that long. I basically already felt like I was committed. So I think what drew me to the reading group, what kept me coming back was this notion that the left is dead. Which really affirms my experience in the Pacific Northwest doing environmental activism, and involved in these groups where young radicals like myself, who are just excited about politics, are involved in and joining it with aging new leftists. And basically reenacting the 70s for a few years before the young student activists, grow up, burn out, get jobs, become depoliticized, or they move on to careers, on nonprofit boards or in just kind of semi-professional, like Democrat-aligned organizing. So coming to Platypus, and I was basically one of those that just kind of got bored and got a job and moved on. But then, I saw there's this Marxist reading group here in rural Oregon. I better take that opportunity because there's not a lot of rural farming towns in Oregon where you can join a Marxist reading group. So I better do that. And then showing up and reading Lenin and Luxemburg and Marx in the context of the syllabus in the structured way, ended up feeling like this education that I should have gotten as a young activist, but I never received. So I can only imagine how much further along I might be now in my political and historical understanding, if I had found Platypus a little earlier. So for me, this decision has meant a little bit of a re-examination of my past convictions, not so much through the lens of how could I have been so stupid? How could I have believed, how could I have joined these weird fringe sectarian groups? They tricked me. No, it's in Platypus, it's more about looking at it in the context of the death of the left and just the absence of socialism and how that void kind of produces these discontents and kind of fatal attractions to these weird kind of dead ends of the left that are products of the baggage of the defeat of the left. And that includes things like radical environmentalism. So, and then and also just in terms of my personal growth, trying to understand the text in the syllabus have involved me kind of going and learning, being more proactive and just learning basic history. So I was only vaguely aware at best of the revolutions of 1848. But this is before joining Platypus. No idea of what the Paris Commune was. Just a vague impression of what the German SPD did or what happened to them. And I still have a lot of learning to do, but if it weren't for the reading groups and the coffee breaks, I never would have really wouldn't even have known where to start in learning that history. So it creates a structure where I feel like I absorb and retain the knowledge a lot more easily than, if I had just sat down and picked up Das Kapital and tried to read it on my own without any context or support, I probably would have just gotten bored and moved on to reading something else. So recently I assisted Andony and I kind of collaborated in preparing an iteration of the Freedom and the Anthropocene panel at Oregon State. And then we also did an interview for the Platypus Review with the environmental writer Derek Jensen. And I think just in that process, and then also just having been in Platypus, I think the things I learned about myself are that when I was an activist, I kind of thought of myself as I'm kind of the theory guy, and it turns out, maybe I was compared to the activist left, but after being in Platypus, it was very humbling, and I realized I actually didn't know anything at all. I just throw out everything that I thought was theory before, basically. So it's actually been pretty refreshing to just kind of just put all that aside and then put myself in the position of being a student and learning without, without the added pressure of having to then, because when you're an activist, if you read theory, it's like, well, now we have to use this to justify our activism. So that's a lot of pressure. So not having that makes it a lot easier to learn, I think. So, and then since a lot of the initiatives I've been involved with have had to do with environmentalism, I think the biggest thing I've learned about the left is just how difficult it is to host a conversation on environmentalism that actually goes anywhere political. It seems like a topic that's particularly prone to devolving into a kind of, I don't know, as an example, just it devolves into like romanticism about, people watch too much TV, or something like that. So I think the biggest question that I would like to find an answer to that I, would still like to pursue is like, maybe something like how would like a dictatorship of the proletariat deal with environmental questions? I mean, there's that kind of critique that you hear of like, okay, well, wouldn't socialist factories also pollute still? So because of that, I think there's still a good discussion or an interview or something on environmentalism that we could organize that could be had out there. But so I'm interested in finding out what that would actually be. And then what I think I've learned about Platypus is that, well, like when I came to that first reading group with Anthony, I was kind of expecting like a bunch of guys sitting around, talking about how we should nationalize the railroads or something like that. And then I show up and it's like just Anthony and myself, and he hands me these pamphlets by like these like weird old like Polish and Hungarian guys, and I'm like, then I was suddenly like really confused because this didn't match, what I was reading didn't match what I imagined Marxism would be at all. Then I kind of realized that that's actually the point a little bit. My preconceptions of what Marxism was are actually kind of products of the left's decline and degeneration, so that the Platypus kind of exists to document that and highlight that fact and kind of provide a historical baseline for what Marxism and socialism used to be, but then also pointing out that, that historical left also failed to achieve socialism. So the question then becomes, what that means for the left that came after that I participated in. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Carson, so much for your responses. Let's see. Next, it would be Grant, if you're ready.
Sure. So I have a little prepared thing that I'll go through. It's kind of short, but maybe I'll just leave some more time for others. So the first thing I'll say is that when I asked to join, I didn't fully realize what Platypus was. I had just begun attending reading groups and coffee breaks and felt committed to continuing. I didn't have a real sense of scope or scale of the project, to say nothing of our peculiar position on the dead left. To introduce myself a bit, I just received a BFA in studio practice from SAIC, where I spent most of my time more or less evenly in the sound department and the Department of Visual Critical Studies. My political background, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you able to raise the volume at all?
Let me try. How's this? Is this better?
That is better. Slightly. Maybe, yeah, just speak as loud as you can and we'll hear you.
Okay, I can get a little closer too.
Sorry to interrupt you. You can continue with your remarks.
No worries. Let's see. My political background was minimal. I'd done some activism, not a lot, but even less critical thinking. I considered myself left, but I impulsively became most interested in whatever appeared the most radical. My immediate memories of my political activity were a series of anti-police brutality protests in Chicago, reading about the Weathermen, organizing a 4th of July techno party fundraiser for an organization doing activism and legal work against ICE and immigrant detention centers. But I became increasingly jaded by the apparent impossibility of making any tangible difference in the world, but not simply by my own efforts. I developed a general pessimism towards activism and politics altogether. At the time, this frustration pushed me to learn more about Marx, who was one of the first figures to inspire me when I was an early teenager, however shallow that exposure was. I considered attending SWP or DSA meetings, but Platypus seemed to me to be the most sensible starting point, as my classes with Chris at SAIC were so moving. Platypus had an intellectual rigor that I hadn't experienced before, which I had sought elsewhere without success, the ability to commit, or both. I find that as I further my learning in Platypus, history comes into sharper focus, as does the present, and my intrigue intensifies. The political frustrations I'd experienced prior are not elided or shunned, but addressed critically. I feel less like I'm shouting into a void than trying to describe its shape. The only extra primary reading group activity I've been involved with up to now, that's actually happened, is the current Art and Politics virtual reading group, which has proven helpful for me towards negotiating the relation between art and politics, sharpening my ability to consider art critically and to place it historically. My education in art school was mostly what has been called undigested postmodernism. What passes there for leftism is decolonization, identity politics, and climate activism, all of which I took up, pursued, and became disenchanted with. I learned there, in art school, not without suspicion, that consideration of these topics are bound up with art, that to be an artist, these topics must be of the utmost concern. Through the Art and Politics reading group, but also through Chris's lectures at SAIC, I've begun to parse out for myself why this is not necessarily the case, or at least hasn't always been so. Notably, as was brought up recently during the reading of Benjamin's Experience in Poverty, I found the discussion of the critical capacity of aesthetic experience to serve my understanding of the death of the left, for instance. I'll end with a short anecdote. When I first went through the members packet with David Faze, I posed a hypothetical that if Platypus failed, Marxism, being as slippery as it seemed to me, might easily become buried or forgotten. I wondered if someone far into a barbaric future could ever devise an ideology that would be as adequate as Marxism. But necessarily, if one ever sought answers to these questions, one would inevitably rekindle Marx's legacy. It occurred to me recently that this may be precisely what we are doing or attempting to do in Platypus.
Thank you for your remarks, Grant. Again, sorry about the volume, but we had some people in the chat box asking about it.
All good.
Okay. So now it would be Jakob.
So I've also written something. Pardon my English. Yeah, I'm from Berlin, Germany, though I'm at the moment in Minsk, Belarus for an exchange semester. In Berlin, I study Slavistics, and I've been a member of Platypus since the August of 2019 after joining the reading group in September of 2018. I originally found out about Platypus because of old Facebook friends of mine from my time in the Green Youth, the youth organization of the Green Party 10 years ago. I don't even remember which articles I read back then, though I think Why Not Trump was among them. Looking back, however, I think what appealed the most to me was the willingness of Platypus members to stand by their positions in Facebook discussions. I guess I thought, so those are the smart leftists. In the following months, I kept coming back to the Platypus Facebook pages every now and then, and when I found out about the reading group in Berlin in September 2018, I decided to give it a shot. What primarily sparked my interest was a feeling of not knowing enough about theory, while at the same time assuming the role of a socialist in discussions with friends and other students. Most of my talking points I took from reading stuff like Jacobin, German left-wing newspapers like Jungle World or Junge Welt. Also, an important, maybe the most important influence on my left thinking were the novels of the German Leninist novelist Dietmar Dart, whose books I was drawn to in my undergraduate years. It was all pretty disorganized, but still discussions became heated very quickly. On the other hand, I had been at 2 or 3 meetings of the German SDS, the student organization of Die Linke, and was pretty disappointed because there everyone wanted you to do something right away, get involved, and I was really not sure for what that meant. For a while, I had been quite euphoric for Bernie Sanders and Corbyn, though that euphoria already faded by the time I came in contact with Platypus. I had a growing feeling of, okay, maybe the stuff isn't working, but no one wants to talk about that. This feeling was accompanied by a growing frustration with the left scene in Berlin. Like in Berlin, this scene is pretty ubiquitous. When you study, you can go to a protest any day you want. Many bars have some kind of left heritage. However, all this is primarily marked by some sort of tribalism where everybody hates each other and hangs out mainly in their own small circles. And people are pretty much okay with that situation. Also, through studying Slavistics with a focus on Russia and the post-Soviet world, I was confronted with the history of the left, and especially the heritage of Stalinism pretty much on a daily basis. And neither the answers university provided nor the typical left takes on that felt satisfying to me. I now realize that the stuff I found online spoke to all of these presuppositions and motivated me to go to the reading group. Also, I remember that I liked the syllabus right away when I found it online because it had a lot of stuff in it that I had always wanted to read and that you never get to read in university. In a way, I looked at Platypus as some kind of last chance to actually read all those fundamental texts in a systematic way. Through the first months of the reading group, I think what kept me there were mostly the moments in which I read a text, and after the discussion in the reading group, I had the feeling of, okay, I've read this now and understood some of it, and it's not at all what I expected it to be. The first one of those moments came when reading Adam Smith, and had them later again, most fundamentally, I think, with the 18th Brumaire, with Rosa Luxemburg, and with State and Revolution. And I think that all those moments combined kept me with Platypus in the end. I got the feeling that Platypus encounters these texts in the history with a certain degree of honesty that I hadn't seen in other settings. The feeling that we were encouraged to think about these texts at the reading group and that no form of action had to come right out of it. A lot of this is owed to the pedagogy Stefan does in Berlin, because he has a good feeling for the aspects of a text that you haven't fully wrapped your head around yet and keeps pushing you on them. All of that while keeping an eye on the abyss between the historical Marxist left and today's left. Throughout the year, I saw that abyss more and more clearly, and that is what motivated me to join in the end. When Stefan gave me the members package last summer and I read through it, I was surprised nonetheless by how ambitious Platypus' aim is. And from time to time, I'm still somehow struggling with that. A reading group with 5 or so people seems really far away from really clearing ideological obstacles or having any impact at all. But what I do see is the necessity of the Platypus project, the necessity of discussing the depth of the left, the necessity of looking into the abyss of regression. I do have more of an understanding now of why I feel deceived by the tribalist left I encounter in my life in Berlin, because what they're doing has nothing to do with reaching the aim of socialism, and they don't even want to speak about that. What was really helpful for that was the German Platypus conference in Leipzig, where the difference between what speakers were saying on the panels and an actual politics of socialism became really obvious at points. For me, this, however, opened, on the other hand, the problem of what to take away from all those panels beyond just trying to be the smarter leftists. Ever since I've talked about this a lot with Stefan. In any case, being able to identify this void helps a lot to not fall prey to the pressures of becoming active for this or that, which I'm keen to, but which has also always frustrated me because it needed a kind of self-deception that is intellectually exhausting. Not needing that self-deception in Platypus continues to be a really pleasant experience. Finally, I think that I personally have become less offensive or even loud in discussions on politics, be it among my friends or my family, because knowing about the inexistence of emancipatory politics and therefore the impossibility of a right view on the present political moment makes it way easier to just listen to other people's thoughts. This is a really nice side effect to the Platypus experience, and one which was helped a lot by the discussions on Trump in the members list. After the end of the first year and just becoming a member, the withdrawal of the guy who should take over the reading group from Stefan caused us to reshuffle in Berlin. I myself had to take on the pedagogue's role for the winter semester, in which we would do the reading group on Stalinism. This was for me a lot of responsibility to take on, yet it did work okay. And for me, it was most interesting to see how teaching a text really changes the way you look at it, and furthermore, how the themes of the Stalinism reading group are connected to the themes of the primary Marxist reading group. I believe I've never had such a condensed learning experience as in this semester. Therefore, I'm now really excited about trying out the pedagogue's role in the primary Marxist reading group from September onwards. And yeah, that's it.
Action, Jakob.
Cool. Shall I go next? I think I'm up.
Yep, Luke, you're what we have.
Yeah, thanks for organizing this. I wish it had been done earlier, because I think this is a bit what I've been missing in my platypus experience, this feeling of being part of like a cohort, because I didn't get the traditional introduction through a reading group. Instead, I found Platypus online, kind of just searching for something. And so I joined up almost, only a few months after discovering the syllabus. And I had a real lack of someone to kind of share the excitement and like mind-blowing nature of some of the provocative statements that you hear from Chris and Platypus, especially at first. You're like, I'm just a normie, undigested Democrat or whatever. And then all of a sudden, like, wait, Trump, about race, about gender, about history, about the left, all these like leftist figures that I had some familiarity with, all these tendencies. So I was really missing someone to just, well, I wasn't entirely missing them, because I would text a friend I made, kind of canvassing for Bernie. I would text him about this stuff. And that was one of my first actual experiences, or one of my first interactions on the list, was being reprimanded by Chris for sharing stuff externally. Because I mentioned that I had shared some story or something he had written, an email he had written about Kant and like his opinion on prehistoric civilizations or groups within like the bourgeois society, or after bourgeois society had kind of started or whatever. And so I didn't mean to like, share stuff that I wasn't supposed to, but I just had this kind of burning need. Every time I would read something new and provocative, I just needed to like make it my own and talk about it with someone and kind of recreate the argument on my own. So anyway, hopefully this can, we can all keep in contact a little bit more afterwards. So as I said, I kind of came to Platypus on my own, and then tried to not break any of the rules, right? Tried to do it the right way, by turning well, let me start a little bit earlier. I kind of got interested because I was canvassing for the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign, and I quickly got frustrated. I had this feeling of being lied to, basically, how the Sanders 2020 campaign kind of abused the term socialism. And I found it very unsatisfactory how Jacobin and these podcasts I was listening to kind of did the same. And I found myself adopting some of these, these terms that I heard, like non-reformist reforms. I remember myself saying, and like knowing I didn't know what I was talking about, and that there was a deeper history to it that I Wikipedia'd it and whatever, but still I didn't get the sense of what it really meant or why it was inappropriate. And so I felt I was in danger of building a whole worldview on like really shaky ground. And so I did the thing that probably a lot of us did, is reached for Marx, right? Try to go to the most authoritative of primary sources. And in doing so, the Platypus syllabus came up in my Google search. which was a big relief because it had these like excerpts and shorter essays that were way more accessible than Das Kapital. But also, they also pointed to something that seemed like certainly much larger than the questions that came up in the Sanders campaign, but also like they were posed more as like a solid question or a concrete question than simply I would get from reading Das Kapital, which seems to lend itself. I heard someone in a different platypus discussion saying it serves as like a Rorschach test that you can project anything onto. And Marx was certainly being used like that by Jacobin and the other people in the Sanders campaign that I was aware of. And so I wanted the opposite of whatever that was, right? Some authoritative totality, some like greater understanding of the socialist project. And so I started with the lettered weeks, in the primary syllabus. The Menand and Proust epigraphs probably were the first things I read. And immediately I got that sense, just like of my own ignorance, basically, but also that it was pointing to something. So that was refreshing. I did, however, get the sense, or maybe I had the thought that platypus was too abstract, as someone said in the panel yesterday. But that seemed necessary and maybe like the only honest approach at the same time. So I started, or my first exposure to platypus was really through trying to be a pedagogue, right? To myself and to my friend who I was doing the readings with. We were both trying to teach each other. He had more experience like on the left. He thought of himself a bit like a theory guy as well. And so he had read, all 3 volumes of Capital, and, he called himself an authoritarian communist or something. It was some like online leftist jargon. And so he like immediately dropped that after we started discussing the syllabus together. Yeah, each reading, even without any pedagogy from outside of the two of us, we could sense a sort of directedness in each week's reading, like almost like there was a distinct lesson or takeaway that we were supposed to get from each reading about that reading, but also that it was supposed to apply to this kind of totality, this greater understanding of Marxism. And so that really drove us to take it seriously, I think. So of course, this idea of learning through teaching, and I was homeschooled growing up until high school. And so we all, as a homeschooler, you always learn with people of different ages. And so you're constantly teaching and learning at the same time. So I thought that was very natural for me, but it's also rare to encounter, some like an organization or a group like Platypus that intentionally structures itself that way. Right, so like not even now, I'm basically a reading group contact who joined Platypus immediately instead of waiting for a full cycle of the reading group to finish. So I go into every reading with like into the discussion rather, with these kind of vague, a jumble of vague ideas about the reading. And then they somehow tend to come together at the end, especially if I'm the pedagogue, right? So it doesn't work as well for me if I'm a reading group member. I get a different sort of understanding at the end of it. And I don't quite know how it works yet. But it just seems to be the case that I can answer other people's questions when I'm the pedagogue, when I'm like playing that role. And it'll like suddenly, there'll be like a flash of the whole thing making sense. Whereas that doesn't happen when I'm just a reading group attendee. I don't know. I'm also constantly struck by this need to reread the thing that I just read, like all of them, and to try to hold them all in my head at the same time. So that's, that's a really interesting and inspiring feeling. Also a humbling one, because it's like, you feel like you just understood this concept and then it leaves you, or at least I get that, or that you're missing some little some connections. So the reason I joined, I guess, is that I felt the need for leadership or mentorship or something like that. I was missing that feeling that you get from like literature class in high school when you read a novel and you can kind of hear the author's idea in every sentence, right? So I wasn't getting that from the texts on my own. I really had no idea. And I think I had developed a resistance to a particular type of learning through my earlier education, like a resistance to historical and biographical context, especially about the authors and their times and whatever, and what ideas had inspired them. Because when that was presented, it seemed to like devalue or diminish the ideas that could otherwise come through in the text, right? It seemed to make it so much smaller and, meaningless. And now I'm kind of thinking that my negative reaction could have been a reaction to a sort of historicism, or even my own impulse to historicize in that way.
You got about 2 more minutes.
Okay, sorry, I'm just rambling. Or my own impulse to historicize of like when I would look on Wikipedia and try to fit, an author or a book into some idea of history that I'd constructed for myself. So I knew I needed better pedagogy. And and I think I found that immediately when I joined Platypus and got access to the listserv, and the pedagogues calls. Those were the first things. They were just so provocative, and it made me into like this kind of new convert who just wanted to talk about platypus all the time. And so I managed to get a whole bunch of people together to at least try the reading groups, right? And I probably sold it in all the wrong ways, like not really understanding what Platypus was trying to do. I was just like, you have to experience like these crazy ideas, It was that kind of sales pitch. Like, this is totally mind-blowing to me. Just come to reading group one time. And so we cycled through, or in terms of attendance, we had probably 40 people come to the reading group over a 6-month period or whatever. And of course, most of them didn't stick. And the first iteration of it completely flamed out and failed after about 8 weeks. We had some internal disputes because I didn't have a command over the ideas either. I was like experiencing them for the first time and trying to stand them, as they say, but it didn't go very well. And so then the next iteration, we started up with the winter syllabus, and that one has gone much more smoothly. And so now we're still going strong with about 4 or 5 regular attendees each week. So the last thing I want to end on is about Sanders. I feel like I was able to let go of my attachment to the Sanders campaign pretty quickly. It was through an intentional effort. Jan, who kind of recruited me, he had me read some articles about the Sandernistas and whatever, and I was able to kind of just let it go. Like it wasn't really part of me, or I didn't think so anyway. But I'm also worried that maybe I'm just like repressing my resistance to some of the main platypus points. And so that there might be this unconscious resistance that perhaps surfaces in my inability. I think it's through it. It feels to me like it's ignorance, right? But I also notice a difficulty grasping certain concepts that seems to be beyond the actual level of difficulty, right? Because once I've understood it, I'm like, oh, that wasn't such a difficult concept. Why did I have to reread that for 3 weeks? Why couldn't I just like accept the lesson? Or when you finish reading a work and you're like, oh yeah, every sentence is saying the same thing. But before you come to that conclusion, it's not clear. So yeah, anyway, I started to understand my interest in Sanders as part of this orientation against and misunderstanding of neoliberalism. And I also wanted to say that I appreciate Sam Copeland's essay very much. I feel like he captured the kind of emotional ambivalence that I had towards Sanders, like the strong emotional attachment, and then the way that kind of the whole millennial left who was on board really just like dropped it afterwards, and has kind of, or at least I feel, this kind of like revulsion at my own past, participation in that a little bit. And I think I also understand that this is part of not being able to let go, and like, maybe wanting to have had a defining cultural moment, or something, or a political moment or something like that. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Luke, and thank you to the rest of the panelists. So before we get into Q&A, there's one thing I wanted to plug. Platypus's podcast, Shit Platypus Says, they are also doing an initiative with new members of this generation. I don't know when the episode's due out, but check probably next month. It should come soon. They got, I don't think any of you are on that episode. It's all other new members, as far as I know. It ought to be a really good segment. And so, yes, so Q&A, some of the questions are rolling in. Let's see. Do you have any responses that you all wanted to make to each other? Anybody wanted to ask the other panelists a question before we get to Q&A? No? Okay, more time for the audience then. So the first question comes from Aaron Haygood. The question is somewhat of a long one. I'll just read it to you. I don't know if you all can see it or not. Today in the OrgCom discussion, we talked about how it can be difficult to understand the purpose of our public fora. We say our purpose is to host a conversation on the left, to curate the symptomology of the death of the left, to reopen previously closed questions, to dissolve ideological obstacles on the left. But how do we do that? How do you personally learn from panels? Who is our audience when we host these panels? What do we need to do to meet our goals when organizing a panel? How are we currently failing and or succeeding? And how do these reflections about panels relate to the reading group experience? So whoever wants to start.
If no one else really wants to answer right away, I'll say something quick. I think the panels are, I kind of see it as like having to eat my vegetables or swallow a difficult pill to engage with them, because they seem, I guess this is my problem with symptomology in general, right? That since I'm kind of coming to Platypus without much history on the left, and as someone who's kind of, I mean, obviously not really a blank slate, but maybe more so than others, it can seem a little bit it can be frustrating to hear other people work through their symptoms and the symptoms of the left in general. And the panels seem to, yeah, I mean, spin their wheels, and participating in a reading group is the same. Like now that we're on Zoom and I can see my facial expressions when I'm listening to other people, sometimes I notice that I just look very frustrated. And I think that's good, because otherwise I would skip over some of those symptoms and just say like, it's not me. I would avoid thinking about it. Whereas this makes me wonder, I mean, the panels and engagement in the reading group, they make me wonder, like, am I being honest with myself? Like maybe I do have those hangups as well, or those symptoms as well, or maybe I would if I really thought about it. So I'm not answering all.
I can add to that a little bit. I would say that I'd imagine that this came up in particular because of the panel that happened yesterday, and I was reading on the list that there's some question about, whether the last word is for a platypus member. How is it that we engage the left? These kinds of questions. My experience with panels is that, even if there's not a platypus member on there, there tends to be, everything gets kind of thrown into relief in the midst of the panel. And so I'm never thinking about the panel just alone, but in the context of the other things that Platypus offers me, whether it's Platypus members' articles or things from the reading group, there's always like that context there. So it feels to me like supplemental. When it comes to our audience, well, I guess let me back up a little bit. I wouldn't say that it's just supplemental. I would say that it allows, because I think a big part of the Platypus project is the death of the left. It's like the core of it. And I would say that it gives the dead left a chance to speak for themselves in a way that's kind of like, just like off the cuff, which can be useful. And I would say for our audience, this one I've kind of struggled with because it doesn't seem to me that our audience is consistently non-Platypus members, meaning like that doesn't seem like the bulk, and maybe I'm mistaken, but it doesn't seem that, it seems like by and large the panels are an educational tool for Platypus members or potential recruits. But I don't know, maybe others have had different experience.
But also Kevin lists like some of the more high profile academics and people who are listening in.
Right, and so here and there that the people show up from outside of Platypus altogether, but I guess what I'm getting at is it's not consistent the way I consistently see a mass of Platypus members at our panels, but maybe that's kind of like here nor there.
I mean, I'm always amazed how many of the people I was aware of on the left turn out to know about Platypus. Or like, I mean, I was really influenced by Adolf Reed before I learned about Platypus, right? And then I learned about this deep connection, and it makes the whole, dead left seem very small and interconnected. And also Leo Panich. And when he was reacting to Chris yesterday, it just seems like, well, they don't really have anything to say to Platypus. They're also just struggling with it in a way that's very revealing, right?
Like, I'm not sure about the online panels, but on like when still real panels were possible, I just remember that like going to Leipzig to the German conference and there being on the first actual panels, like after 1.5 years in Platypus in the reading group, and going there together with old Platypus members with contacts who just joined for some months ago, and I found it really interesting that like going through the panels, the point of the death of the left was pretty clear to was made more clear to me, but also to like people who just came into the reading group and like just were there for 2 months and did not have that kind of exposure to the ideas Platypus like you get through the mailing list and so. But it became like out of this like collective experience, I don't know, it became pretty clear to them. And I found that like really helpful also in the following, like being able to talk about this afterwards, coming back to points from the panels in the reading group, and like discussing those and how they relate to what we're reading, or and yeah, I'm myself not so sure about the like I've listened to some online panels and to those from the convention. I'm not so sure if they have the same effect for me, like without being in the room and being like having like the ability to discuss this right away with other people inside Platypus. And yeah, I don't know, but I got the point of a panel when I was there in real, and also like it. I don't know, we haven't been able to do this in Berlin, like mostly out of like not having like the human resources for getting this together, but also out of like hostility. And I was like, when I was in Leipzig, I was kind of sad that I didn't have this earlier, because it would have, I think, at some points clearer earlier on. Yeah.
I don't know if Carson has anything to add. Oh, and just to make sure, the part to the question she added, do you feel like reading group helped you to understand the panels that you were watching? Did you feel like an education on the historical left helped understand what the contemporary left says?
Definitely.
Yes.
So what I was going to say earlier is that the reading group for me kind of functions as like a spine, where then everything else can kind of like be a constellation around it, and I can sort of like understand through panels or articles from other voices on the left, or I can kind of parse through via the material of the reading group.
Yeah, like yesterday, Cliff was really helpful. Before the panel yesterday, he had like an hour before that where he talked mostly with me about the panelists and like what he was expecting that they were going to say, or the positions that we could infer from their past writings and positions. And then it was interesting to see how they didn't even live up to that, right, in what they said. And so of course one of the functions is to hammer home how dead it is, or the points that like Chris makes on the listserv about them being nothing but Democrats or whatever. Of course that's true, but the other fact is that we can learn something from their past writings, right? Like is his name Chris Mage? No, whatever Mage. Like he has a writing that we read in the Stalinist reading group, summer reading group, right? Which I haven't read yet, but apparently it's a high symptom in that sense, whereas what he said yesterday was like totally not, right?
Just for posterity's sake, to whoever watches this video later, the panel that is being referred to is one that was hosted in May 2020 called "What is Capitalism and Why Should We Be Against It?" Go find it on YouTube. Okay, I think we'll proceed to some of the other questions. Let's see what we have. Rory Hannigan asks, I wonder if the panelists have more thoughts on the specific experience of this historical moment of the last couple of years. Grant mentioned anti-ICE activism, and Luke mentioned the Sanders campaign. Does thinking about our moment as the sixth phase of Platypus help make sense of your experience this time and of joining Platypus during this phase?
I think thinking about the phases is really difficult, and it feels like it's kind of beyond me as a new member, as do a lot of the organizational questions that Platypus poses, and things like organizing panels and participating in the org-com stuff to the small extent that we have to. But I also feel like it's important to take on those responsibilities, like it's to learn about how Platypus fits into both the dead left and the reaction against it. I don't quite know how to answer this question fully, but
like Stefan in Berlin puts a really big focus on making us know about the history of Platypus in a way, like coming back to where when Platypus began, talking about Occupy, or about his own experiences with the left over the last 6 or so years in that he was involved in Platypus. I don't know about if the phases help me, but what I do know is having this experience, that Stefan is recalling from his own Platypus experience, transferred to me in a way, because for example, I know some of the stuff the left has been talking about in Germany in the last 10 years. Like I've heard about this, but you also fall prey to the thing that you forget because stuff just falls out of the public discourse. And Stefan, out of his Platypus experience, referencing all those positions the left has long forgotten, and like how nobody keeps track of them, and that has been really helpful in like understanding this process of perennial forgetting the left is trapped in. Yeah.
So I'll add, and I'm going to tack on, Spencer just added a pickup on Rory's question. He asks, how much do you perceive the history of Platypus entering Platypus as you are at this stage? Do you feel that relationships to older members or the presence of older writings, recordings, impart to you a sense of Platypus's moment of inception, its experience of the past 13 years, and indeed the experience of older members? Does this help to process the experience of the current moment, sixth phase? So what I was going to say before to Rory's question, but I guess I think it also relates to Spencer's question here, is that my sense of the phases is a bit blurry still. It's, I get the sense that through the reading group and through other platypus activities, the most sort of like in focus idea I have about the left and the history of the left is the left that's past and not the one that we're living through. However much that comes more into relief as I see more panels or engage with the left more today. But I do get a sense of, I would say that there's a sense of like a core commitment that Platypus has that I see when I go back to older recordings, older writings, stuff like that still continues today. But I haven't been able to make much sense out of the differences on a finer scale.
One other small point about the sixth phase is that it makes my experience, it kind of contextualizes it in a way that makes it seem less personal for me and more like I'm a product of the left, right? Rather than just some lost person looking for meaning and failing to find it, right? It's like, no, this is just what happens, phase in and phase out, that people get caught up in some movement or moment and then it fades and they go on to other things or change their politics or just go into mainstream democratic politics or something, or radical movementism or whatever, it being the same thing.
Carson, do you have anything to add about the left that you all experienced that in Corvallis? I don't know if you went around with the DSA or anything like that.
Really, my political participation here in Corvallis has pretty much just been with Platypus. So I don't know. I guess early on I was like a soft kind of Bernie supporter in 2016. But I guess at that point I'd already been burned once by like activism on the left, and I was just not, I guess I felt like I could just skip to the end where I stop caring and go back and do the reading group. So I don't know. Hopefully that's not too depressing, but yeah, I've really just been focused on doing my own thing and then the reading group here in Corvallis. So I've actually tried to avoid jumping in and like canvassing for Bernie or anything like that. So.
Let's see. Some of these questions have been raised that relate to other questions, so we'll just try to maybe finish a thought. Pamela Nogales asks, adding to Spencer's question, am I unmuted? Oh, yes, okay. Pam asks, adding to Spencer's question, how have you made use of the Platypus archive to clarify your education in platypus or to deepen your relationship to its history? And if so, what was the last thing you looked up and why?
I have, like, not massively, but I have, like, from time to time in the evening when I had nothing to do, looked up. I've listened to, I don't know, there was a teach-in, some guy who knew Ernest Mandel gave at the Platypus European Convention, stuff like that. I've listened to that. But it's pretty unsystematic. It's basically like I click on, I open the archive page and then I look what sounds interesting. Or like I've listened to some panels. But yeah, it's not in a systematic way. Or like I've also like used the Google groups and just like typing in this word, looking for what were discussions on that. But yeah, that's yeah, mainly when interest hits me at some moment.
Yeah, I do that all the time. Like since I always feel really nervous before leading a discussion as a pedagogue or whatever. I feel incredibly unprepared. And so like the last thing I looked up was like on the iron law of wages, and like to understand other people's questions on that. And so what I usually do is like every instance of it, I'll open in a new tab and then force myself to read all of the threads, right? And often there's like a link to articles that Chris has written on it or someone wrote about it. And so that's a really good way to get kind of a broader understanding of a topic, I've found.
I can relate to what Jakob said. I mean, when I have the chance, if there's something that's been pestering me, I'll search it on the Google group, or I'll see if there have been articles written in the PR about it. But I also have used it. Well, David Faze, who leads the SAIC reading group, has used it quite a bit to help clarify questions that come up there. And so we've referenced it a lot through that.
Okay, so the next question comes from Kevin Dong. This is for all the panelists, and it's short. So it says, why should we care about the death of the left, and what do you think we can learn from it? It's short, but it's a big question, really.
I mean, I would say that it's kind of, I think myself and Carson, I think both describe the left as a void. I mean, there's a sense like that we need to care about the death of the left in order to overcome it, in order to, potentially create one that's not so dead and rotting away, potentially, create emancipatory politics. So, I mean, that's what I would say to that. I don't know if I have a much more in-depth answer.
Yeah, I think it's not clear to me yet. Like if the left just disappeared from history, what would happen? I'm not sure. Would it come back? Would it reconstitute itself? I think maybe, but it would be a lot harder if like the history that we learn in Platypus is just kind of like forgotten, or it's so distorted that by like the dead left and misinterpreted that it throws up a barrier to anyone who's trying to access it. So I don't know. I feel like if there is, so like if we're in a pre-political moment, if there does in my lifetime ever end up being an actual political moment, I maybe will recognize it better or know what to do better. And I won't be part of like the inevitable like left reaction, like pseudo left reaction that would actually thwart that political moment and be a drag on some kind of actual revolution. So I don't know. That's kind of my I guess fantasy that at some point in the future maybe there will be like a socialist party that I could join, you know. But I don't know. It doesn't seem like that's, you know, imminent anytime soon. But I would like to be prepared in that case, you know.
I've really been struck by, I mean, this is no news to anyone here, but how the left was responsible for its own demise and how that constantly happens over and over again, right? Even within my own head, like I can, you know, if you take the Marxist, but not, you know, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, you know, like Ebert or Scheidemann or, you know, Bernstein or whoever, if you take their arguments seriously, they do make some sense, right? And so you can see in your own head how, you know, we do have arguments against the thing that we like spend most of our time thinking about or care most about. And it's natural and kind of like reasonable in a way, and how Marxism is totally unreasonable. Like, especially when you talk to family members or non-platypus members about it, you're like, yeah, I know I sound like a crazy person. I know I'm being incredibly contradictory, but just hear me out for like 6 years, right? I don't know, what can you say?
Yeah, it's really it's a difficult question, I think, but I can say like on a personal level, like I've tried not to care at all about the left, and that also hasn't worked. Because the question comes back in a way. The question of like some sort of emancipation, it stays, and like, yeah, and like that's, I think, what I'm trying to get through Platypus, getting to that question, or yeah, maybe being able to see the moment when the question is being answered. I don't know, but like I think that the question, like that the question of the left, of like of human freedom or something like that, remains, and I cannot get away from it, like even if I wanted to. Yeah.
I think I didn't address the second part of Kevin's question, but I do want to. So the second part was something to the effect of, what do we learn from the dead left, or what could we learn from the dead left? And I just wanted to throw in that I had this experience yesterday while watching the What is Capitalism panel that had had I encountered Leo Panich speaking the way he did yesterday in the past, without the preparation that I've gotten through Platypus, I probably would have just like gone along with what he was saying and not had any ability to analyze it or like understand actually what he was saying. And so by engaging the dead left, I'm kind of practicing why do I disagree with this? Why does this kind of rub me wrong? And I can kind of formulate to myself those answers.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is specifically for Carson, and it comes from Nancy Falkus. I'm not sure how to say your last name. I will meet you soon enough, and then I'll learn. Let's see. For Carson, I also just recently joined Platypus this year. One of the most disorienting experiences for me has been learning how to apply the things I've been learning through the reading group and the list in an attempt to understand the left symptomatically. On the panel yesterday, I was surprised to see that Shane Mage, an ex-Spartacist, had taken up such a strong environmentalist position. With your background in environmental activism and interest in environmental issues, what was your take on his responses?
Yeah, I noticed that too. And it kind of reminded me, like in my opening remarks, like I talked about the aging new leftists who kind of hang around like these radical activist groups, and he sounded like one of those people, basically. Like, and I wonder if it's maybe just them tailing after whatever it is millennials and young people are doing in order to stay relevant. So they see like Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement, and that's kind of where like the youth are, and so they are drawn to that as a way of maintaining their own relevance. So part of it too, I think, could be just like Trump and Brexit derangement. Like something I've noticed is that like a lot of these leftists are just, you know, we talk about post neoliberalism in Platypus, and I think they react to the end of like the last phase of they react to the end of neoliberalism as if it's the apocalypse. Like it's the end of like this phase of capitalism is just the end of the world to them, because I don't think they take capitalism seriously. I think for them it's just become a pure force for like corruption and greed. I don't think they take seriously the ability for capitalism to actually adapt to a crisis and come out of the other side changed and more productive, but then also distorted and corrupted and like setting itself up for the next crisis. And instead of seeing that change as like an opportunity for the left, they just want to take that and just like threaten people with like the climate apocalypse. And then I guess the point being just to like make everyone so scared that they go out on the street and like force technocrats and like the state to just, you know, I guess ban cars or something, or like you know, nationalize all the coal power plants and shut them down. I'm not really sure what it is it seems like they view this as like a dire situation, and that's so imminent that we have to take action now, and we have to like put questions of freedom and you know, emancipation and like all the things that the left used to be concerned with, like aside. And it kind of reminds me of the way, because I watched Planet of the Humans recently, and then kind of to clear my palate, I watched Adam Curtis's All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And that documentary kind of traces early environmentalism and how these kind of this concept in the 70s, there was this concept of like ecological balance, and how society could be run like along ecological lines. Like you wouldn't need politics anymore. Everything would just be kind of this like self-regulating system. And like this was really popular with like Cold War cyberneticists and like early Silicon Valley people. And the New Left at the time, like a lot of them actually protested this as like a conservative measure, but it seems like now they've just adopted it. Like they want that they're able to avoid the question of politics by bringing up environmentalism. So that would be my response. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else. I guess I'll open that question up to anyone else who wants to contribute.
Yeah, anybody else particularly moved by the environmental initiatives we've done recently? We've done a ton of panels and interviews.
I mean, I found them, they're helpful. I think one of the first striking things about Platypus was Josh Price telling me, like you could imagine a green capitalism, which I had never tried to imagine before. So that's kind of been like a slow thing in the background for me. I just finished a project with a climate scientist, so it was a part of my interest. So that's been like a slow development for me through Platypus. But yeah, I think what we've engaged recently has been really useful.
Okay, so the next question comes from Tom Cannell or Cannell. I again apologize with the pronunciations. Tom asks, could the panelists talk a bit more about Platypus being in a pre-political stage? You know, we call ourselves a pre-political project. Do panelists feel a need to have any kind of political engagement in their non-Platypus lives?
I will say that I feel, even though I kind of cringe looking back, I am grateful that or happy that I took part in the Bernie Sanders campaign, canvassing and just talking to people, because nothing can kind of replace that experience of like the difficulties you run into, and how really the political nature of it gets in the way of the kind of project that Platypus would want to do, or even the beliefs that people espouse. They call themselves socialists or whatever, but really how it's impossible to be a socialist or do socialism or whatever when you're participating in one of these campaigns, no matter how hard you try, right? No matter how passionate you feel about it. So I think that's important experience. But do I like rebel against that? No, now I feel quite comfortable with Platypus being a pre-political in a pre-political moment and a pre-political project. Like, of course, we should want it to not be, but like it's not the first step to like make it, like Democratic Party politics or turn Platypus into a party or something. Like my impulse to do something is not really what I'm struggling with right now.
I mean, I'll add to this. I think what Chris said yesterday on the list, I thought was like really kind of put a point to my thoughts on the pre-political aspect, that it's not a choice, but a historical condition, or it's conditioned by our historical moment. So I think that like that feels very real to me. And since joining Platypus, I haven't felt much drive at all to have political engagement beyond Platypus. And I think part of it is because I've been trying to devote as much energy as I can to sort of formulating, at least like a core education through Platypus. But there are certainly topics that I'm interested in that don't get covered in Platypus and aren't necessarily Platypus topics, which I want to, investigate later on. But I'm not there right now.
I do really feel the lack of engagement with, the sectarian left or something. Like I've never been to a protest before. I've never had these experiences that you get from, or you maybe used to get from doing Platypus like live on a campus or something. And I've just never had that. So I do feel its lack.
I think it's funny that I don't have any experience with the sectarian left either, really. In fact, but then like people who are critical of Platypus like call me a sectarian. And it's like, I find that very funny that like we've kind of watched the sectarian left drift away, and to maybe like younger millennials, like Platypus actually appears like we're the sectarians, just because I think like we're the only group left that even brings up, even as like a way of, even demonstratively, the things that the sectarian left brought up. So like we just kind of sound like them a little bit sometimes, and I think people confuse us for like, I don't know, some Maoist trot sect in like the 80s or something.
Yeah, I can relate to like actually not having that, because like I would have like this thing where from time to time a friend would like ask, let's go to this protest together, and I was like, yeah, and then I would like pressure myself into going there, like already knowing that it would be like a very unpleasant experience in the end, and that I don't really see the sense of it. And like what Platypus has actually helped with is not pressure, like seeing that emotional pressure you put yourself under when you not go to a protest, that you're like somehow, I don't know, responsible for the evils in the world. And in that way, it has been actually really helpful to be in Platypus. And also like going, like we went to May Day last year in Berlin, like to the legendary Berlin May Day demonstration with Platypus members. And like being there and like reflecting on how not just lame but also unpolitical this thing is we hear has helped being more, I don't know, thoughtful about the emotional pressure you put on yourself when you feel leftish to go to this or that thing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So the next question is from Richard Rubin, and it actually sort of relates. It's about this, this kind of experience that maybe you lack as the left liquidates itself. To what extent do the panelists feel that they want Platypus to provide more education about background knowledge for the text that we read, for example, historical knowledge?
I'm enjoying the Litka reading group leading up to the Kautsky summer reading syllabus. I think that stuff is good. I think as a wannabe pedagogue, I've definitely find myself lacking in historical background knowledge and the need for that. I don't know how much. I'm interested to see how like the American Revolution and perhaps French Revolution kind of lecture series goes this summer. I'm really looking forward to it. And so I would say that I do want that stuff, but also I want to see how much I end up getting from it. Because like we're always being pulled in 8 different directions of like there's so much to read and learn, and like what's the most important thing to learn next. And this historical context seems like you can get a lot out of Platypus with kind of a rough historical understanding. But I'm sure maybe that's just from I don't know what I don't know,
I think in the past I've kind of confused Platypus with being like a like a classroom or something, I recently applied for the mentorship program, and a couple of the things that I asked for, wanting to learn about, were the bourgeois revolutions and the American Civil War, for instance. And Richard's question, but also I was kind of just thinking about it. It makes me think like whether or not that's Platypus's role. And I would like to teach just like kind of the basic history. And so I would say that as much as I want that history, I'm not so sure that it has to come through Platypus. Like, I'm not so sure that I couldn't learn those things on my own, or even with the assistance of Platypus members, like giving me book recommendations or something. But yeah, so I guess I'll just say that, because I think that these topics come up enough in Platypus related conversations that I don't know, the weeds can be pulled in that way, I guess. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I do know that like Stefan bringing up some history at a reading group, like it helps. It helps understanding in a way, but also I think it can get like I don't know, reading like, for example, the Deutsche texts for the Stalinism reading group. Like obviously there is a lot of like history in them, but that's not like fully the point you want to encounter in it. And I think like you can get stuck on the history point if you don't like if you're not aware of like the political or historical points of the texts. Yeah, but also like I don't know. Pam did a teach-in in Berlin while we were doing the first part of the reading group. on 1848 with like loads of dates and background and names, and that helped a lot in the following to get a sense of 48 and of what it meant. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question comes from Danny Jacobs, and it is, what was the strongest reason you had before joining Platypus for not joining Platypus? Has your opinion on this reason changed? Has it even been supplanted by another reason, perhaps, not to join Platypus?
Well, this one's easy for me because I was trying to get the reading group off the ground. And the reason it disintegrated, the first iteration, was because I asked the group, like, should we become a chapter of Platypus, thinking that was possible, right? To be more than, you know, first for me to be a member, and then to get the benefits of Platypus pedagogy and whatever other resources they had. And, you know, in our little reading group, we had about 8 fairly regular attendees at the time. And, you know, 2 of them were, you know, self-proclaimed Stalinists, right? And they were like, so this is a Trotsky organization and Trotskyist organization, and, you know, the Frankfurt School were all part of the CIA and all this stuff, to be very careful, you know, in your relationship with these people and whatever. And like, they kind of freaked out the other kind of non-sectarian, you know, kind of just normal liberal people who are interested in socialism. And so it all just disintegrated kind of around this question. And so, yeah, I kind of went ahead with it anyway, because I thought, you know, it was hard to try to lead the reading group because the texts clearly have a lot in them that you're not getting without some kind of platypus pedagogy. So I knew we needed that. I knew I needed that. But yeah, I'm obviously glad I joined.
I think any hesitancy I had in joining Platypus, I guess, just came from my like suspicion that if I joined, it would be like another activist group. Oh,
Carson, are you there? I think your
yeah.
computer, I think it might have froze for a minute. So you said Platypus, you were worried about it becoming another activist group. Did you have anything else to add? Oh, Carson's cutting in and out. Okay, I'll give him a moment to get situated. You there, Carson?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. You were finishing a thought about you were worried Platypus would become an activist organization.
Right, that I would, you know, join and then just get sucked into like going to protests and like handing out flyers and stuff, which I wasn't interested in. And yeah, I guess for a long time I was kind of like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, okay, these readings are interesting. I like Antony. You know, when is like some crazy thing gonna get pushed? So I guess I was just kind of waiting for that to happen, and it never did. And I realized, oh, this is basically about what it actually says it's about. So, and I've been doing it long enough, so might as well join.
Yeah, I think I had some kind of, I don't know, like fear of joining a cult, like already knowing, like from the experience in Berlin, that it's probably not a cult, but still like some sort of anti-authoritarian fear of like becoming part of a group and I don't know, having subordinating yourself to that group in a way in your thinking. I think I feared that the most. That has changed. Because I think that I've become clearer about in my thinking about teacher-student relationships. Where also I think the experience of being a pedagogue yourself has helped with that. And yeah, that was my fear.
I would second what Jakob said to a certain extent, but a big hurdle for me was also just the ability to commit. And I don't know whether or not that was Platypus that changed that in terms of its content or just changes in my life, my personal life at the time. But that was probably why I hadn't joined priors, because I was, I didn't commit to anything really in this way.
If I could perhaps add to this question, just the thought, how did you go, or are you currently in the process of thinking about this yourself, but how did you go from wanting to merely learn from the project kind of passively to then actively wanting to reproduce the project? How did you make Platypus feel like it's something you wanted to continue?
I feel like I'm using and abusing everyone else just for my own personal learning, even like when I'm trying to be a pedagogue, right? Like, I don't know if those people are ever going to take it seriously, but it sure is helpful to try to teach them or teach myself through talking to them. So, I mean, hopefully it helps Platypus, get a foothold in Shanghai or China or something, but I mean, I hope.
Yeah, I agree. I think just my own, I feel like I've a lot more and a lot faster, and my understanding is member than just as someone in the group. Like, especially being in the Google group too, and just having more immersion in like the discussions that are being had. I feel like I'm able to like some of these like trickier sort of self-contradictory things that you kind of have to like understand seem clearer to me now. So
I might go out on a limb and say that part of why I made that switch from passively absorbing Platypus to actively participating in it is tied up with the anxiety that I think sort of like activist mentality is tied to, where there's like this anxiety that you need to do something, and if you don't do something, then you're going to be like upset with yourself later when it all comes crashing down or something like that. And so, maybe that's like the one sliver of a positive practice that makes any kind of sense, is trying to assist Platypus wherever you're able to. Maybe not, but that's my first thought.
Yeah, I think there, hearing it, there might be some truth to that for me too. But also it's like, I don't know, like going for the reading group for a year, and Stefan asked me right at the end of or like in one of the last weeks, if I wanted to join, and it was at the end of this process, which I think made sense. And like I had this feeling, okay, this organization put together this thing that makes sense and which I have been following for a year now, and I don't really see a reason why not to join that thing that makes sense to me. So why not give it a shot? And yeah.
There is this kind of fear that I've been like wrong about everything else. So what if I'm wrong about this? Like, am I going to grow out of Platypus? Like I, feel like I was wrong about the Bernie Sanders campaign or whatever. Like I noticed Nancy left another question in the chat about China, and she was in some of the chat groups I was in, and I was probably, a royal asshole, and I'm sorry to everyone who had to witness that. But like, I have, picked up different ideas and like shed them fairly quickly, and then like continued participating in groups and whatever, because I thought, I wanted to see how it played out, right? Maybe they would also follow me in my, selfish little personal journey. Yeah, she has another half of that question about the left in China, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole necessarily.
Well, if you have any brief thoughts, anything to reflect on in China, I'd like to spend the time we have remaining hitting the questions from newer members, because the panel's for them just as much as it is for you all. So go ahead and address that if you want to, Luke.
I've tried to talk with some leftists in China, but mostly they're kind of just anti-Chinese government people, and like for religious reasons, for censorship reasons, generally about one issue or the other. And so I think that, their experience of politics is, at least as obscure as ours is. Ours being Americans or whatever. Sorry, I'm not sure where you're from, Nancy. Yeah, it's tough. I hope to make the reading group in Shanghai bilingual over the next couple of years, but we'll see. Saying that out loud to kind of pressure myself to actually do it. There we are.
Best of luck. Okay, so the next question from a pretty recently recruited member is Rebecca Paredes Larson. I don't remember if that's your last name or not. I feel like I've seen that somewhere. Hello, perhaps this is a more personal question. So basically, she's discovered that her relationships with her friends who are long-term leftists have become strained as she's become more involved in platypus. Issues like colonialism, feminism, and environmentalism have put a strain on her relationship with friends. How have your friends reacted to you joining Platypus? That's a big question. And how do we keep friendly dialogues open with other leftists, even when political disagreement is starting to become seen as toxic? As a new member, she's interested because that's been one of her greater challenges.
I mean,
Geez, I can relate. Sorry, go ahead, Grant.
I was just going to say, I think Platypus is a lot less dogmatic. Like, I don't know, when I was in art school, it was like super like black and white. Like if you didn't agree with everybody, then you were like a racist or like a rape apologist or something. So I feel like I'm able to be even more open-minded now. So like, I'm able to disagree with my friends, and if they get mad at me, I'm like, oh, that's fine. Like, it's all right. So I don't know. It doesn't really, it hasn't been much of an obstacle for me.
What about other leftists you don't know but are meeting? How do you stay cordial?
I don't know that I've really encountered any leftists on my own outside of Platypus since I've joined. Not any serious leftists anyway. I've had friends tell me like evolution, not revolution. And I'm just like, okay. So that's about my experience since joining.
I can relate to that. Like, I also feel that like me after Platypus is way less dogmatic in discussions than like just university me. Yeah, I have some like there is also this thing with where you have left friends who actually don't want to talk about politics, though they talk about politics all the time, and they like it's just this like thing because like there are no other topics. And with those, I've like no like being more knowing more about like the inexistence of politics at the moment. Actually, like the discussions are less heated also when I think they say something stupid. because it's not that important. We won't like rule it out here in my living room. We can talk about it. It can be interesting, but it's not. The world does not, rest on this.
I think that since everything, I mean, it's kind of easier to concede points to people or to understand where they're coming from, even when they're saying something that's anti-platypus or whatever. You know, like Chris does, right? It's like you see people try to argue with him or the more experienced platypus members, and like often they'll just agree with what people's criticisms are, because that is how the world seems and therefore how it really is, right? Like all of these things are not just necessary forms of appearance, but that's reality as well. And so like people's observations about, you know, whatever, how wrong Marxism is or whatever, it's like, well, you know, kind of also, yes, you're right. Like, yeah, so that's helped me lighten up a bit. And it's not something that I've always succeeded in doing, but something I hope to do better. I've definitely pissed off a lot of like friends, not necessarily leftists, but just like random passersby in my life. And yeah, I'm going to try to stop doing that.
I think one of the big things in staying cordial with people is not sounding like you're just repeating some kind of dogma. Like if you just are talking to someone and they feel like you're repeating some kind of like party line or sectarian line, I think that just completely turns people off, and you just sound like a cult member to people. So yeah, definitely don't just like quote Chris Cutrone at people or even quote Marx at people. You know, it just, I think that's when I've seen arguments get hostile and kind of.
Oh no, did we lose Carson again?
If I can add to that, or but I've also had the experience that like I've had this friend who I wanted to join the reading group because I thought like that this could be good for him and good for the reading group. And like I don't know, I've maybe over a year a few times repeated like the party line and talking about the death of the left, and also like this helped our conversations because like I also didn't want like to, I don't know, like talking about those concepts, even if you haven't understood them yet fully, to people who don't know them at all, can be helpful also to yourself. And yeah, and also it worked. Like he came into the reading group. So.
Yeah, it's honest. It is like, and it's what attracts me to Platypus. And I don't know that there are very many members of Platypus who are like afraid of, you know, confrontation or, you know, contrarian ideas, right? Well, those kinds of people actually end up being members in the long run anyway. So maybe it is worth, you know, not insulting people or just making enemies, but for people who are leftists or interested in the left and you think might benefit, like sure, your relationship might be in a little bit of a dip at first, but they're likely to come around to these ideas at some point, you know, and maybe they'll kind of open up to it later.
That's profoundly helpful. I know the Spartacists used to have a line that, you know, anybody you meet could be the next Lenin or something like that. And that can be a challenge, I know, for many members to not give up too soon, so to speak. And then maybe to Rebecca's question, I would just say that in Platypus, we have this phrase, admit everything, concede nothing. It's a very, very important thing to keep in mind that, yeah, everything the left says about the history of Marxism, no matter where they're coming from, it's true to some extent. It doesn't mean that we concede history has to always turn out that way, though. We hold out hope, like no other leftist organization does, that history could be different. Okay, so another question from a new member, Niels Frisius. Being a member that was also recruited in the 6th phase, I can very much relate to a lot of the motivations and issues you mentioned in your remarks. there are two things that I reflected through my platypus experience, especially through contact with older members. First, the aspect of me not being involved in sectarian groups or in larger forms of activism before. And second, that I seem to digest the platypus pedagogy too easily. At the moment, it seems to me that this is an advantage, but I fear that it might also be or become an obstacle. Do you experience this as well? And if yes, how do you think it should be confronted?
I think he's picking up on a point I made there, but I'd like to hear what the other three of you have to say about it.
For me, I think the danger that I try to avoid is trying to understand a position by just adopting it, because I think that's a really easy thing to do. And I'm not sure if there's like some trick to not falling into that, other than, I guess, well, for one thing, keeping in mind, so like if we read Lenin, it's really easy to walk away and just be like, wow, this guy just sounds right about everything, you know? But then you have to remember, yeah, but we don't have socialism, they failed, you know? So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that through everything we read, you know, ultimately what we're left with is just capitalism now. So
I would say that I have the weird experience of like maybe every other reading group. I feel like I was like, oh, I just got it. And then I have one where it's like, I didn't understand a single word, you know? So I try to remind myself to think and think again. And like, that's, you know, just like, you know, just stick to it. Whether or not you feel like you really have it, or whether or not you feel like it's a struggle, I just try to stick to it. Not get carried away.
Yeah, I also like, I know the problem, like, and I've also asked myself this, and I've even talked about this to Stefan in my recruitment talk, and Stefan also said like that, like, oh, you're way I don't know, you're adopting this faster than I was back then. But yeah, I can basically subscribe also to what you just said, that like there are those moments I think I got it all, and then like next reading group talking about something I really thought I got my head around, and it's not there in the same way. And it's also like, yeah, talking to different people, it becomes a different thing to yeah, express. But yeah, I don't know, but I know the problem. I'm also thinking about this, but yeah, maybe also don't have an answer.
I think the answer might be in the dead left and the importance of the panels. And like I talked with Tom Cannell before about how his experience with the dead left or the sectarian left or his past, you know, it really helps me understand the issues that other younger, like millennial reading group attendees bring up, because they bring up kind of the same objections, but less consciously, right? Whereas he does it very intellectually, honestly, and you know, it's just very clarifying and helped me prepare for the next thing, and also kind of see it in myself that like, oh, you know, I also do have this hang up, even if it didn't seem like it before. If you think about it enough, you can like see it that way too. Yeah.
Okay, so Lori Rojas and David Fays are asking a question about our moment, and I think perhaps now would be the time to get in other questions because we're about to wrap up. So they're asking sort of about opportunities and challenges to recruitment, or to just explaining the history of the left to people your age or even younger. Within the next year or so, we're going to continue to receive a flood of new students that are coming, and they're going to have questions What do you think they're going to need to know? Not just what they want to know, but what do you think they'll need to know? And how do you feel like you'll be able to teach them?
I think the most interesting part of the question is, for me, actually, is the obstacle to recruitment. And I think it's the lack of urgency of the moment. Like, I think the attendees in the Shanghai group are like, platypus is very interesting, and this is the first time I've experienced these ideas, but why join now? It seems like I can, move on with my life a little bit, and this will still be here after I do my PhD program. And, it's not like anything's happening on the left. Right? So they just think it'll be there. So maybe that's what they need, is like, this sense of the task of history, the urgency of, the Benjamin point or whatever. I don't know.
I mean, I feel like this is it's kind of a tough question about what the way David put it. What kinds of questions do you think new students have about this history, and what do you feel you need to learn in order to teach them? I feel like it's both a difficult question and like an incredibly easy one, that like I need to learn the reading group and more, or the syllabus more. But on the other hand, it's like I have no idea. I have no idea what I'm going to need to tell them. I don't know. I don't know if I have a really good answer for this question. Maybe patience.
There's a way that like Adorno and, well, especially Adorno, but like the Frankfurt School, they can do like an imminent dialectical critique of like almost anything and arrive at, this critique of capitalism and need for socialism, right? And without making it seem, ham-fisted and just dogmatic. And I mean, that speaks to like the wide breadth of knowledge that you need in order to see like the task everywhere and be able to articulate it in a way that's accessible to people. Accessible, yeah. I mean, got to learn how to meme, right? Memes.
I think like like my questions are becoming in a way more like about the history are becoming more specific in a way. I don't know. I have like before Platypus, I had an interest in Stalinism. Now we've done the Stalinism reading group. Now I would like to get more into the effect Stalinism has had on the New Left and stuff like that. And I guess that in a way, like thinking about those questions also helps teaching other stuff, because like we get like if you get in a way like if you have more knowledge about the history of the left and like about the regression of the left, it like plays into all the questions we're talking about. And yeah, but I don't know. At the reading group right now, like right now, we're taking part in the Cologne reading group with other people, and it's interesting that I think people don't have the same questions I had in the beginning, and yeah, I also not always know how to react to that, even as like just a participant in the group. Now my English is leaving me.
And to continue this theme, Stefan asks, could you talk about how you regard the relationship with Platypus, hosting the conversation on the death of the left, and our broader practice of giving our members a broader liberal education? This sort of relates to this last question about what do you think you'll need to know?
The hardest thing to convince people of is of bourgeois society, right? And that's also the thing that, I mean, I sometimes feel like, oh yeah, I get how like as much as I need to know about this for the purposes of whatever text we're reading, but I don't, right? And I know that because I can't convince anybody of it, right? And yeah, it's just so fundamental to like the platypus project, and so disappointing when, you know, like educated liberals or whatever like won't accept it, you know, no matter how hard you try. Like you'll be talking about the same texts and the same people and the same events and drawing radically different conclusions.
I think that I in a way obviously like and also people that are now with me in the reading group came to Platypus for some kind of liberal education because you don't get it at university. You like I've never read Kant or anything like that at university. I've never read Hegel. Like I don't know. I study Russian and we've never read Tolstoy. um, so yeah, I think that like that just happens. That people like that's gonna happen in the future also. That people who want this kind of education, they stumble onto Platypus. They'll maybe join or join the reading group. But I think that from the way that the syllabus is made, getting from those like texts that are interesting for your liberal education to like the platypus point, like the more political point about the history of the left, can be possible if people stick to it, and even maybe make like more sense to people if they've not been exposed to the dead left as maybe people have been earlier, because they can see this line clearer leading from the classic liberal text to the Marxist text. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the mentorship program to be able to work on ideas like that. I know I phrased my question in a really stupid way and I regret it immediately if I sent it, but still, like that's the kind of question I asked about, and hopefully someone will help me make something out of it.
Final thoughts?
I do have one final thought, and I'm not so sure how much of it is a necessary room for improvement for Platypus, but it's a thought that I've had a few times, that I think for my generation, especially the sort of cohort that I came from in art school, the identity politics, decolonization, Me Too, all these things, which Platypus has a different take on than most other places, most other people have encountered. I want to learn more about our take on these like present hot issues, because I feel like those are the sorts of questions that I'll be approached with when asked about Platypus. I mean, these are the questions that my friends are investigating outside of any left thing. But I mean, my hang up with that has always been, how are these things related to the left in any way, if they are? And but yeah, that does seem like an obstacle for people who are interested in a sort of eclectic mix of identity politics and socialism and various other things.
Yeah, I don't know quite what to say, but thank you all for being teachers on the list and for taking the time to educate me, because I feel like everything in Platypus is directed at me personally. Like I always feel like I'm being targeted and singled out for like every teaching moment, teachable moment, and like new syllabus addition that we have. And yeah, it feels oddly personal, but and I'm trying to like take things in a personal way and not ignore them and avoid them because they don't apply to me, or like that's not my symptom or whatever. So I mean, whatever, I think this educational model is really working and inspiring. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone as well. Thank Anthony for running my Corvallis reading still on. And like I said in my opening remarks, I just wish I'd found Platypus sooner. I might have avoided some kind of like silly politics. So yeah, thanks everyone.
From me also, and like hoping to see you guys next year in real life.
It would be nice, yeah. I appreciate reading all y'all's comments on the list. It's very, very helpful. Yeah. And thank you to David for inviting me to participate. This panel's been it's been good to share my experience and hear from others. So appreciate that.
If we were all in the room together, you'd get a big round of applause. I apologize, I can't simulate that on Zoom. This brings the panel to an end. Thank you very much to Luke, to Jakob, to Grant, to Carson, and to all the participants in the Q&A. This recording will go up as soon as we can, and if we can make it available to the public, then we will. All right, thank you very much.